We begin as Israeli President Herzog. Now he's been running events and delivering speeches, trying to calm the waters, if he can, right now in the country, and initiate dialogue on judicial reform, even convening a panel of academics to craft a type of compromise proposal. And while we, the public, appear to be seeking and clinging to any signs of softening positions, or dare we even say compromise, the president's efforts have so far not appeared to create any real momentum amongst the actual lawmakers, who have more or less, from both sides of the aisle, condemned his initiatives as irrelevant so far. But we want to get into the latest now, and on that we're joined by Dr. Evan Cohen, the former foreign media advisor, to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. So thanks for being with us, Dr. Cohen, on this. Look, first, I have to look at the president's activity. I mean, he's been busy these last few days. I think in many sense trying to put on a show that there's something good happening here, that compromise might be reached. Is there any weight or substance to what the president's doing right now?
Not the past few days. This has been since the initiation of all the protests, the very vocal protests. The president has intervened. I think that what he's trying to do is to facilitate some sort of dialogue which will enable the government to reach a different outcome to what is currently being worked on. I wouldn't even call it a compromise. I think that what they're looking for is agreement, because both sides agree on one thing, well, almost both sides agree on one thing, is that we need some sort of change to the current system. This current system is flawed and this needs to be changed. They don't agree exactly on the extent of the changes necessary and what kind of changes we need to have, but they agree on the fact that it has to be changed. And the current problem is that there is no dialogue between the government and the opposition. However, and this is very important because this is something that the president has initiated, there's plenty of dialogue between the government and those who oppose the government's plans, not the opposition, but those who oppose the government's plans. The dialogue is being conducted under the auspices of the President's House. It's being conducted in the Knesset. It's being conducted in various forums. The opposition, I think, is failing to fulfill its obligation towards its electorate, in that it is not coming to the table to discuss. But in the meantime, discussions are ongoing, and I think that the program is moving forward with these discussions.
Look, if I can, summarize, I think much of the public angst here has to do with, watching a new and fully, right-wing government, self-described even here, really shoving a dramatic reform through without any broad consensus, with the opposition in an uproar, and it's altering the fundamental nature of the country's judicial balance here. Do you think that why, in other words, from the perspective of the coalition, why is it so important to shove this through right now the way it is currently, to just move forward at breakneck speed the way they seem to be continuing to do?
So when should it be done? That's the question. I mean, the judicial reform.
It's more a question of how should it be done. I mean, is this the way that it should be done?
Absolutely.
As you just mentioned, it's not a discussion so much of should it be done.
The government.
Why this way?
The government and the parliamentary majority, which the government has in the Knesset now, are representing a certain part of the population.
A narrow majority, yeah.
The majority of the population. I'm not even going to say the majority. They have 64 as opposed to 56. Out of the 56, there are several people who also want judicial reform. Okay, so we're talking about more than 64 seats in the Knesset who want judicial reform, and the government has to push this forward. The government doesn't need the consensus of the opposition, and I would like to remind the viewers that minority governments in the past passed things which were far more dramatic, without a majority in the Knesset, without even bringing the things to a vote in the Knesset.
But also without 500,000 people coming to the streets. There's an optics issue here with the way this is being done. There's a messaging issue.
Absolutely, but 8.5 million people did not come to the streets. We have to remember this. So there's plenty of people in the streets, and that's fine. And we're a democracy, and I think that people have the right, people have the obligation to object if they feel that the government is not fulfilling what they want. But the government also has to consider its electorate. It cannot ignore the fact that the majority wanted these judicial reforms. The majority stand behind them. In fact, recent polls show that 70% of the population in Israel support some judicial reforms. Okay, so these 70% have to be around some sort of table and discuss.
It would seem the coalition should see those numbers and say, hey, there's a better way we can do this. We can actually get consensus buy-in to get the country.
How does one reach consensus?
Maybe to hold open discussions with those.
Absolutely. Let's hold open discussions. And I think that they should be holding open discussions. But the thing is that the opposition are not willing to hold open discussions. What the opposition are saying, okay, let's look at it this way. There are two possibilities. One, the judicial reform moves forward, and one, that it stops. Okay, those are the two possibilities, generally speaking. The government says, let's negotiate how it's going to move forward, and the opposition's stance is extremely clear. Stop the judicial reform, and then we'll talk about it. That's not how it works in a democracy. Okay, we're not going to stop the judicial reform, which is essentially what the opposition wants. They don't want the judicial reform. The politicians, not the people. The people want judicial reform. The politicians do not want judicial reform, and this is something which people are not looking at enough. The leaders of the opposition do not want the judicial reform, not because they're opposed to the judicial reform, but because they believe that they will lose political power if indeed they reach some sort of compromise.
What we're hearing a lot of from the coalition is, anti-left, anti-right. I mean, this is the terms and way this is all being spoken about. We're talking about, everything that's happening in the streets of Tel Aviv and elsewhere as anarchists. This is being framed by the government itself as a real battle of left versus right. Isn't there an inherent folly in that right now in a country as small as Israel that needs consensus, that needs to have people bought in on the system in place?
Israel is a parliamentary democracy. The majority controls the parliament.
So why are they talking that way, the government right now? They're talking about right. They're talking about left as the enemy.
But you yourself define the government as a right-wing government. Okay, so it is a right. It is words, yes. No, but you define them as a right-wing government. It is a right-wing government, just as the
I didn't define them as a right-wing government. They're a right-wing government.
Okay. So they're a right-wing government.
They are.
I think that the electorate of the right-wing government expect the government to advance right-wing policies. This is what they expect them to do.
In a fully right-wing manner.
What other way is there to do them? To advance right-wing policies in the left-wing way?
No,
that's not the way it's done. Look, when there were left-wing governments in power,
we've never seen a government like this. I want to remind our public here, we're watching right now, that this is a unique government.
Absolutely, I disagree with you 100%.
You disagree?
The government in 2015 was composed of almost exactly the same parties in the current government, with an additional party, a centrist party, but it had all the parties of the current government in it.
Except
in fact, many of the people were the same people, and many of the ministers were the same ministers. I do not agree that this is unique in that respect. On the other hand, I don't see why in Israel we always talk about these right-wing governments and we don't talk about the fact that the other governments were not centrist governments, they were left-wing governments. They advanced left-wing policies, and that was never criticized.
Yeah, this is. I mean, you seem to be furthering the arguments that the government's making. It's the left is the problem, the right is.
No, it's not a question of the problem. When Rabin had his left-wing government, he advanced left-wing policies, and nobody, by the way, denied Rabin's government's right to advance these left-wing policies. They opposed them. They didn't deny his right to advance them because he had a majority. When Olmert formed his government, a left-wing government, okay, he'd like to call it a centrist government, but he advanced left-wing policies. Once again, what they did was they toppled the government via the parliament. This is how it's done. And so I don't see any difference between what Rabin did and what Olmert did, what Sharon tried to do but didn't quite succeed.
To be the public, the wider public.
No,
at least a big portion of it is perceiving this to be different than those
the problem is that this government is not on the media side. The media opposes the government. The general mainstream media opposes the government.
I have a hard time hearing it's the media's fault.
I'm not saying it's the media's fault. Okay. I'm saying the general media opposes the government. Okay, there's no question over here that channels 11, 12, and 13 oppose the government.
The government and the media.
No, it's not. It's not. So the image that people are perceiving is via certain branches of the media, which are projecting this image. And once again, in a democracy, that's fine. This is one of the roles of the government, I think, will be to liberalize our media market so that we have a lot more opinions on the media, a lot more balance in the media. And once we have that, then I think that people will be able to see both sides
I hope that becomes the case, because I do think it's perception at this point that's driving a lot of people in the streets.
But perception is via an image. That's what I'm saying. We have an image. Who projects the image? There's no question who projects the image.
Dr. Cohen, we must move on. Thank you for